Wonderful, we are now live. We will be giving everyone a couple more seconds to log in, and then we'll be starting our commemoration. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Johannesburg Review of Books event, a commemoration in a virtual space of Achmat Dangor, a man so well known for his felt presence in the real spaces that we have lacked for the past few years. These include, of course, books and literary events, places where he was to be found, offering prescient insights and long chuckles. My name is Ben Williams. I'm the publisher of the review. Today's program director. Achmat was a founding patron of ours, and even now as I sit here, I feel his warmly peering presence off to the side, a wry smile touching the corners of his mouth. Achmat was always up for bookish conversation. He died a year ago, last September, which caused all of us a great shock and lasting grief. Today, we remember one branch of this baobab's life. Ours is a literary occasion. We are here to remember Achmat's extraordinary life in letters. Our panel of eminent speakers will expand on this theme shortly, but a brief review of Achmat's bibliography is in order first. From 1983 to 2017, Achmat published 3 volumes of poetry, 2 volumes of short stories, and 4 novels. Books of poetry were Bulldozer, Exiles Within, and Private Voices. The short stories were Waiting for Layla and Strange Pilgrimages. Finally, his novels were the Z-Town trilogy, Kafka's Curse, Bitter Fruit, and Dika Lady, Child of Tears No More. By anyone's measure, that counts as a productive and fruitful literary life. All the more so when you consider the duties of activism and organizational leadership that Achmat famously bore with his trademark mixture of lightness and gravitas. In 2015, he received the South African Literary Awards Lifetime Achievement Recognition. Of course, it was Bitter Fruit that put him on the world map of letters, being shortlisted for both the Impact Dublin Award and the Booker Prize in 2004. You can find an excerpt of this novel in the JRB. We're about to welcome the first of our speakers, who are Ivan Vladislavić, Gcina Mhlophe, Andries Oliphant, Isobel Dixon, Hein Willemse, Andrea Nattrass, and Mandla Langa. It's an honor for me to direct a program of such luminaries. Thank you all. I anticipate that our runtime will be around an hour or an hour and a half. This may change with the evening's load shedding schedule, of course. We'll aim to stay as dynamic as possible. Finally, before we begin, I would like to extend a word of thanks and welcome to Achmat's family. His wife, Audrey Elster, sparked the idea for this event. Audrey, we, along with literary posterity, all thank you for making this moment happen. Now to our first speaker. Ivan Vladislavić was born in Pretoria and has lived in Johannesburg since the 1970s, working as a writer and editor. His books include the novels The Distance, Double Negative, The Exploded View, and The Restless Supermarket, and the story collections 101 Detectives and Flashback Hotel. In 2006, he published Portrait with Keys, a sequence of documentary texts on Johannesburg. He has worked with artists and photographers, notably David Goldblatt and Joachim Schoenfeld, and edited books on architecture and art. His work has won many awards, including the Sunday Times Fiction Prize, the Alan Paton Award, and the Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. He is a distinguished professor in creative writing at the University of the Witwatersrand and a founding patron of the JRB. Ivan's remarks are entitled, Being Many Things, a tribute to Achmat Dangor. To you, Ivan.
Hello, everyone. My thanks to Ben and to Audrey for inviting me to speak about Achmat and his work. And it's good to be in the company of old friends and colleagues. Achmat and I met in the 1980s at Raven Press, where I worked as an editor. He'd already published several books, including Waiting for Layla, the poetry collection Bulldozer, and the edited anthology of black poetry called Voices from Within. He came sometimes to see Chris van Wyk, who published his work in Staffrider, and also attended board meetings as a member of the Raven Press Trust. He was working in the corporate world and always in a suit and tie. I knew that he was an activist, that he'd been banned in the 70s, and I'd read his poetry, some of it in a tough but lyrical Afrikaans. And I couldn't square that audacious persona with the mild-mannered business person. As we grew to be friends, I came to understand that he was a person of many different parts, and not being able to put them together to figure out the puzzle added to the pleasure of knowing him. He was never one thing or the other. He could be reticent, but he was entirely at ease on public platforms. There was often something melancholy or solemn about him, and yet he was full of mischief and humor. He was a very gentle person, and yet he wrote some of the most provocative, challenging fiction in all of South African literature. I think he delighted in being many things, being at home in different worlds, having many faces and voices. These are qualities he valued and imbued in his novels, whose characters are often lovely hybrids, to quote a phrase from Kafka's Curse. It's remarkable how many of them are people transformed or transforming, moving across barriers of race, class, culture, or gender, changing their names, and sometimes even their very natures. The most memorable of all may be Omar turned Oscar, the same Oscar who turns into a tree in Kafka's Curse. In the 90s, I edited two of Achmat's novels, Kafka's Curse and Bitter Fruit, and we were often together at book events at home and abroad. It was an interesting time when South African writing was being viewed through a new lens, and writers were under pressure to confirm the story that had emerged about the South African transformation. Achmat was both a galvanizing and a reassuring presence at these events. The way he spoke about writing and culture, the viewpoints he was able to defend and balance, created breathing space for other writers, including me. Some of his positions on writing have stayed with me, and I'd like to say a few words about them, partly because they cast some light on Bitter Fruit, which he was working on then, and which we're celebrating today, and partly because they still speak to the present so directly. Firstly, he was independent. He had deep political convictions and loyalties, but he was absolutely clear about the freedom of the imagination. He always defended the right of artists to follow their own lights. When he was asked what he would write about now that apartheid was over, his answer was blunt: "I'll write about apartheid." This was not a denial of the present. It was simply an acknowledgement that the flow of history cannot be turned off like a tap, and that any attempt to remake South Africa would have to pay close attention to the past. He understood better than most where the incipient amnesia of those years would lead. A convenient kind of amnesia, one of his characters calls it. Secondly, he was widely read and deeply cosmopolitan in his tastes and affinities. When he spoke about his literary loves and influences, he would mention a very wide range of modernists and contemporary writers. A few names always came up: Toni Morrison, Angela Carter, Isobel Allende. All women, of course, which was unusual in itself. Writers we turn to for their feminist reimagining of things, for their sensuous and sometimes erotic prose, and for a magical quality, something transformative or enchanted. Thirdly, he was serious about the novel. He liked to tell the story of how a reading of Camus' The Outsider as a young man had transformed his way of thinking about the world. It also clearly shaped how he thought about the novel. He believed in it as a vehicle not only for political dissent, but for moral and philosophical speculation. Bitter Fruit, published in 2001, embodies all these orientations. It is steeped in local history and culture, and very much a Johannesburg book, although it is not often grouped with books like Welcome to Our Hillbrow and The Rest the Supermarket, which appeared in the same year. What's remarkable is how many different Joburgs it holds together. From an ash block house in Soweto to an old double-story newly integrated Berea to a sprawling mansion on Linksfield Ridge. It is perhaps the first novel of post-apartheid disillusionment, and yet it is not disenchanted. It is full of wonder about the things people do, the choices they make, what they go through. It is subversive. Transgression is also a kind of transformation, and the novel has many episodes of transformative transgression. Achmat was the rare kind of writer who does not draw back when things become uncomfortable or strange. He wrote with passion about subjects most writers shy away from. He had the courage of his imagination. Finally, Bitter Fruit is a serious novel, and I don't mean that it is lacking in humor. Unsurprisingly, The Outsider features explicitly in its pages. Mikey, one of those lovely hybrids, a boy who turns into a severe man called Michael in the course of the book, is the clearest descendant of Camus' Meursault in Achmat's fiction, and the novel stands in that line. It deals with big existential questions: love, sex, betrayal, guilt, vengeance, freedom, choice, responsibility, and death. And it gives us a rich sense of life and a complex moral universe. In this, Achmat kept faith with the best tradition of the novel and enlarged it through his own extraordinary work. Daring writers need daring publishers. We owe a debt of gratitude to Andries van der Merwe for publishing this book. I do wonder how easily it would find a publisher today. Achmat was a warm and generous friend. I miss his humor and his insight. And I miss the conversations over food and wine, as I'm sure many of you do. The conversations will not happen again, but we do have the writing. He poured his spirit into his books, and I certainly find it there when I open one of them. His work should be a lasting consolation to Audrey and Zach, his extended family, and all of us who had the good fortune to know him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I can see in the comments on Facebook and YouTube that we have some notable literary figures. I'd just like to welcome them. Raksea Koa, nice to see you, sir. Eleanor Sasulu, thank you for being here. Krista Kuljin, Nongleba Mashinini is here, and Karen Hurt has an interesting comment on Achmat's interview with the South African band Person's Memory Project, which will be available at UCT, it looks like, next year. Our next speaker, I believe, is available. Dr. Mhlophe, are you able to activate your camera?
I'm definitely.
Wonderful. Oops. It seems like Dr. Mhlophe may be having some connection problems, so I'd like to ask Professor Oliphant to take the stage. If I could just quickly introduce you, Professor Oliphant. Professor Andries Walter Oliphant is a former Fulbright scholar in comparative literature, a writer, and a cultural policy developer. He chaired the South African Ministerial Arts and Culture Task Team and co-wrote the 1996 White Paper on Arts, Culture, and Heritage and its 2020 revision. He is the founding chair of the Arts and Culture Trust. A former editor of Staff Writer magazine and the Journal of Literary Studies, he served on the editorial boards of the English Academy Review, Alternation, Scrutiny 2, and Arte. He formulated the criteria for the Sunday Times Fiction Prize and chaired its adjudication panel for several years. His writings on South African literature, art, and photography are widely published. He is the recipient of the Thomas Pringle Award for Short Stories, the Sunday Independent Book Journalist of the Year Award, and the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Arts and Culture Trust. A former head of literary theory at the University of South Africa, he assisted with the formation of the Academic Nonfiction Authors Association of South Africa, served on the board of the International Comparative Literature Association, and chaired the South African Book Development Council. Professor Oliphant's remarks are entitled Achmat Dangor and the Renewal of Writing in South Africa. To you, Professor Oliphant. Please unmute your mic.
Thank you, Ben, and good afternoon to all the participants. And greetings to Audrey and her family. I was scheduled to speak at the English Academy's event honoring Achmat Dangor's life and his writing sometime earlier this year or last year. I can't remember, but I had been ill and was not able to attend. So I'm happy that this opportunity has arisen to pay honor to a great South African writer. What I want to do is speak a bit about the early cultural experience of Achmat Dangor, and then generally point out the extent to which his work constituted a renewal of South African fiction. Dangor was born in one of the settlements to the west of South Africa, Nuclear, if I remember correctly. During his childhood, that is before the advent of apartheid and the Group Areas Act, it was a very diverse mixed community where people of different cultures and languages lived together across the whole spectrum of the South African population. But then in the 60s, through the Group Areas Act, the apartheid government started relocating people to different ghettos in order to prevent the emergence of an integrated South African population, classifying each of them in a particular manner, providing educational systems for the particular cultural groups in this grand design of radical and extreme segregation. But to Achmat, the memory of growing up in a diverse community like most of us, most of his generation, I may be a few years younger than him, but I was born in Heidelberg to the east of Johannesburg in a rural community, which was also integrated. And that too was demolished. And we were relocated to a township on the East Rand, which previously had been occupied by African mine workers. And they were pushed out further to the periphery. And people designated coloureds at the time from all over the East Rand and further afield were all dumped into that particular area. It was a very traumatic experience for all the people concerned, having to leave their ancestral homes to be dumped into what were really ghettos, almost akin to the Nazi camps that were constructed during the Second World War. Our generation was still children in the 1960s, or in our youth, when the African nationalist movement was crushed by the apartheid government. And silence and fear prevailed in the country. But in the course of the 70s, in less than a decade, in fact, in the late 1960s, ideas began to incubate on the Black campuses created by the apartheid government. I was then an undergraduate student at the University of the Western Cape. Various of the other activists were scattered around universities in the north and in Zululand and so forth. But a development occurred at the medical school in Durban, which was designated for people classified as colors, as Indians, and as Africans. That was the only medical facility available for people classified non-whites under apartheid. And there, a young intellectual, Steve Biko, studying as a medical doctor, explored ideas which emerged in post-colonial Africa, particularly the writings of Frantz Fanon, the developments in the Caribbean, and the Black Power movement in the United States of America. And he formulated a philosophy which the world now knows. This man, this young intellectual and leader, was Steve Biko, called Black Consciousness, which was essentially a counter to white supremacy as manifested in the apartheid dispensation. And the aim of white supremacy was not only to segregate people, but to crush them, to impose their authority and power into their psychology, into their everyday lives, and to render them complete subjects of racial oppression. And it was in that time that at educational levels and later on, even in high schools across the country, these ideas began to filter down. And Achmat was part of that particular experience. His early attempts at writing constituted setting up a reading group with Chris van Wyk and Farouk Asfat in the Western areas. In fact, the Black Consciousness movement emphasized the importance of culture as a means of freeing people and asserting their identities. Of course, the great anti-colonial theorist who understood the importance of culture is Frantz Fanon. And although Biko doesn't quote it, doesn't reference Fanon, if you read his writings, you can see the phrases, you can see the ideas which he had picked up from Fanon. In fact, if he had quoted Fanon directly, Fanon's work was banned in South Africa. So through the Black Thoughts process, and it was a process that permeated the society in the so-called townships, cultural groups, poetry sessions, exhibitions, dances, and discussions prevailed. And that resulted in the renewal of the liberation struggle in South Africa. Barely a decade after the banning of the ANC, there was a new outburst of resistance. And after 76, there was no let-up in the following decade into the 1980s, which ultimately culminated in the negotiated settlement which ended apartheid. So there's a very strong political current that runs through Achmat's writing. But you would think that because of that, his works would be polemical, would be didactic, would be propagandistic, would be pamphlets. There would be very little aesthetics to be found in his work. But that is absolutely the opposite, as Ivan has so eloquently pointed out. For someone deeply involved in politics, committed to the freedom of South Africa, having spent time in banishment in the 70s, and emerging as someone whose imagination has not been stunted, or the oppression he was subjected to has not embittered him, that he came out intact, and that his imagination was not distorted because of what was done to the people of South Africa. At that very time, there was a debate waging in South African literature. It was introduced to the South African readers by Njabulo and Ndebele in an essay published in Starfighter. But its roots actually go back to American literature in the 1960s when Baldwin, the American novelist, wrote about the deficiencies of the American protest novel. And this idea was picked up by Louis Nkosi. He was then in exile. He was part of the writers who were banned in the 1960s by the Gazette Extraordinaire, which listed about 20 writers who were prohibited in South Africa. He had read the article by Baldwin, And he applied those ideas to South African fiction. And he said the South African fiction of the 60s, of the 50s, was very much like the protest literature of America, which lacked aesthetic accomplishment and which often involved a simple protest register or a pleading register or a register that lacked imaginative flights, that lacked aesthetic accomplishment. So in the Bella article, which was later then adopted by Albie Sachs, in which he dismissed the idea that culture could be a weapon of art. But while all this debate was going on, there were writers like Chris van Wyk, like Achmat, like Farouk Asfat, who were charting a different trajectory. In fact, who laid the seeds for the renewal of South African literature long before 1990. And this, as you could have picked up in Ivan's presentation, is very evident. So for me, the importance of Achmat is not only the fact that he was active in the struggle against apartheid, as your biography you read out of him indicates, in setting up cultural organizations, in working in international associations related to expanding human rights and change. In an interview which I conducted with him in the 1980s, I asked him, why have you moved away from Black consciousness? And you think there's a contradiction between the new all-inclusive non-racial movement of the UDF and your Black consciousness past? And he said, no, not whatsoever. Because Black consciousness was never racist. It was simply a strategy to counter white supremacy. And it didn't define Black as a color. Its members included all the population groups, including whites. The idea was to shake off this mental aspect. Therefore, writing was so important to him, culture and expression, to shake off the shackles of oppression and fear that had been inculcated by the apartheid government, especially after the 1960s. When I was a young boy, I was always told, you must watch out. You see where Mandela is. You see where you end up. So our parents were scared of the authorities at that time. And he said to me, look, the African National Congress and the Liberation Movement accepts the authority and leadership of Africans, but that does not imply the exclusions of other population groups. It is simply necessary given the historical situation and given the demographic realities of our country. So in that sort of thinking, it's already a post-apartheid thinking, and his writing already anticipates a moment when this umbrella, this dome that has been constructed over the country, this racial poison that filled the air, would dissipate to such an extent. And in that regard, the arguments related to that debate about fiction and its qualities is evidently what it lacks is it was not able to see what was already going on in the 1960s and the early 1970s in South African writing, which now has to be carried forward. So Achmat was a friend. I worked for the Congress of South African Writers, where I set up a publishing house. He was always generous. He was never authoritarian. I was always a troublemaker, but we always remained friends. So I honor his legacy, and his writings, I think, will remain a monument to what can be achieved under difficult circumstances. Even now, as we change, as we are faced with the veritable implosion of our society, and what are writers going to do? Are they going to lament, or are they going to help chart a path away from where we are headed? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Oliphant. I'm delighted to see that Dr. Gcina Mhlophe has sorted out, seems like, some technical issues. And if it's fine with you, Dr. Mhlophe, we will add you next in the order. I'll just quickly read an introduction. Dr. Gcina Mhlophe was born in 1958 in Durban. She is an author, poet, playwright, director, performer, and storyteller with dozens of awards and accolades to her name, and has appeared in theaters such as the Royal Albert Hall, London, and the Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C. She founded and directed the Zanindaba Storytelling Company in Johannesburg and has received honorary doctorates from the London Open University, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the University of Pretoria, and the University of Fort Hare. This for a vast body of work that has both contributed to and expanded African letters and helped preserve the heritage of African storytelling. She is currently the founder and director of the Gcina Masiko Arts and Heritage Trust. To you, Dr. Mhlophe.
Ngiyabonga kakhulu, ngiyabonga. What a great honor to be amongst these literary luminaries and honoring a great man like our brother Achmat Dangor. I think about him and I think of the first time I ever met him when I first arrived in Johannesburg, this little country bumpkin who knew nobody really except the books I found in my secondhand bookshop. And I was buried in those books one time when a journalist from Drum magazine, oh, Peter, very vibrant and what, and he arrives and what's wrong with you? Why don't you have a boyfriend? You're busy reading books and what? And he teased me and he told me that there was a conference at Wits University at the Richard Ward building. Like I have a clue where Wits University was, as if I knew where Braamfontein was. But I thought a writers' conference, hello, I've got to be there. So I found my way to Wits University. I walked and walked and walked and walked to Jorrison Street. I finally got there. And as I walked in, there were all these people, strangers to me at the time. And I just remember the voice booming, the performer larger than life, Ingwapele Madingwane, fire on that stage. I thought, what is going on? Africa, my beginning, Africa, my ending. Where did I start my writing? I was impressed by a praise poet in the 1970s when I was only 17 years old. And now walking to this place, there's another praise poet doing his thing, saying, welcome, welcome. And I met all of those writers, Professor Eskiam Pahlele, Nadine Godima. I met many, many people, Eugene Skief, I met them there. Mama Miriam Tladi, I met them there. Matsimela Manaka, I met them there. Maisha Maponya, who I was going to be lucky to work with in the future. I met many people who I call the staff writer generation. And I met Achmat Dangor during those times as well. I felt so lucky, so inspired. I wanted to just write and write. By the time I slowly got to read people I had met now, because originally I had been reading writers I didn't know. I thought writers write books and then they publish and then they die. I mean, no, Wordsworth were dead or Shakespeare were dead. My heavyweight A.C. Jordan was dead and many other writers. I thought you just write your books. And so that's kind of a thing that catches you with trepidation when you know that you want to write for the rest of your life. But I remember getting to know Achmat Dangor, watching this man with this sense of quiet energy. And the two things that come to mind again and again when I interacted with him was his humility. Another thing that I found with that quiet humor, he was unjudgmental. And that was something, sometimes that is rare when you are dealing with heavyweights. And so I grew and I performed in different places. I found myself on world stages, but also I interacted with Achmat Dangor when we formed COSO, the Congress of South African Writers. I remember Raksiapa being part of parcel of that, one of the steering the people there driving the ship. And so all of the people that worked at COSO, there was something very, very clear that the cultural struggle was no less important than the armed struggle. Very, very clear. And I was very lucky again to be amongst those people. Even when I joined the committee that was the founding of the Detainee Support Committee, I knew that as a creative writer or as a member of the women's movement in Alexander Township, I was part and parcel of something that was very, very important to make a difference in our country. It was not about living for yourself. It was not about becoming successful and famous and being lauded and celebrated. Every single person had a role to play. I was very clear about that, and the pain that my people were feeling, that many writers were feeling as well. And books that were banned and plays that were banned. We had to go to John Foster Square to ask for permission in the years when we were told that the work we were doing at the Market Theatre was not correct according to the censorship board. And sometimes you just had to change the title of the play. You had to change the lyrics of the song, maybe do them in Zulu or Sepedi or something like that. And it was kosher, stamp. And you hit the stage at the Market Theatre. And also meeting people of different races and different backgrounds was a very, very good place as well. Not only at the Staff Rider platform, Raven Press, but also the Market Theatre, also at Khotso House, where we interacted with many freedom fighters and all of that. But I would like to call on the name of somebody who just would have been one of his comrades and invite him to this gathering. He says, the same. I doesn't care if you're black. I doesn't care if you're white. I doesn't care if you're India. I doesn't care if you're Clearling. If sometimes you're South Africa. You got a big, terrible somewhere in yourselves, because why? For sure, you doesn't look another man in the eye. I mean, for sure now, all the people's is made like God. Sometimes you want to know how I mean, for it is simple. The God I know for sure, he make everybody with one heart. For sure now. This heart go the same. That's for meaning to say, one man no different from another. So now, you see a big, terrible stand here. How one man make another man feel the pain he does not want to feel himself. For sure now, that's a whole point. Sometimes you want to know how I mean? For it's simple. When the nail of the thorn tree scratch little bit of the skin, it does not care if you're black, does not care if you're white, doesn't care if you're Indian or Clearling. The thing that comes off for sure is one thing, red blood. That's for sure the same for everybody. That is Sipho Sipamla. Another great comrade of Achmat Dangor as well was a great man called Richard Reeve. He talks about the end of the rainbow. You know, when you think about the way Richard Reeve wrote, sometimes when I read his writings, I laughed, and sometimes I thought, oh, I'm eavesdropping on men's conversations. But I did anyway, since I know how to read and write. I think of these great storytellers, Achmat Dangor, Richard Reeve, and many others, or Miriam Tladi, or Nadine Kodma. These were great, of Mama Phyllis Ndandala, great storytellers. And as they were storytellers, Achmat Dangor again and again talked about the resilience and the power of a woman who's the backbone of society, the backbone of this African continent. Amakhosikazi, Mandla, that's a fact. Also, he touches on something that is like this wound that we don't talk about often in this country, that is forced removals. many of the ills we are facing today is because communities were disintegrated. They were thrown all over the place. And they ended up in spaces where they didn't know each other. They didn't know who came from where, who's the son of so-and-so, who drinks from which river. All of that was taken away from us. And we found ourselves refugees in our own home. You know, when he says, listen, do you hear the wind ransack the open plains of my heart? Do you hear the crack of that bell? I wonder if it is the bell that was calling Achmat Dangor back home. This storyteller that I respect so much, this great poet, this cultural ambassador, Achmat Dangor, I would talk about him in the words of another great thinker. He says, story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Story told. It told us what to hang on to. That is Lisa Kron. Achmat Dangor, through his writings, through his communication, the kind of work that jumped off the page, he, in his own quiet demeanor, in his gentle, humorous way, in his looking at the pain straight in the eye, he told us, like those opposing thumbs, what to hold on to. I'd like to salute Achmat Dangor. I'd like to salute his family and Audrey. I remember our train rides, Engilande. You remember those train rides, and we had many conversations. I'm grateful to be part of this conversation here tonight. Ngiyabonga kakhulu. Magwande.
Goodness, thank you so much, Dr. Gcina Mhlophe, and also for bringing other voices into this commemoration, including Sipho Sepamla's voice. What an extraordinary passage.
Yeah.
I see that we have dropped, apologies, I see that we have dropped one of our speakers, so we will move along to Professor Hein Willemse. Professor, I will quickly introduce you and then hand it over. Professor Hein Willemse is Professor of Literature and Literary Theory in the Department of Afrikaans, University of Pretoria. He has edited or written several books and published widely on Afrikaans literature and oral literature studies. He served as a visiting professor at universities in Europe, North America, and Latin America. He is a founder member of the Congress of South African Writers, and until recently served as the editor-in-chief of Tijdschrift vir Letterkunde, the oldest surviving African literary journal established in 1936. Professor Willemse is a columnist for several Afrikaans newspapers. Over to you, Professor Willemse. Kindly unmute your mic, Professor. Thank you.
There you are. Can you hear me now? Good evening, everyone. My contribution is a slightly edited version of a tribute I had written for Tijdschrift vir Letterkunde last year at the time of Achmat's passing. The last time I saw him, Achmat looked frail. He stooped, and although his gait was slow, he remained steady. His smile was bright, and he had a glint in his eye. In recent years, we had not seen each other regularly. The last time prior to our chance meeting in Cape Town in late 2018 was at the funeral of Chris van Wyk in 2014. We listened, among others, to Oswald and Charlie, recounting the good old days of strife and struggle in the mid-1980s, showing everyone an old poster from our Writer Forum days. It was at the inaugural meeting of the Writers Forum in the mid-1980s that Achmat and I met. He and the organizers of the Writers Forum, including Chris, Farag Asvat, Colin Jig Smuts, and Dolphin Smuts of the Johannesburg Open School, reached out to Bakalisa, our group of writers and artists in Cape Town. We drove through the night in a rented combi without a proper functioning petrol gauge. Somehow we misjudged its capacity and along the N1 North in the early morning ran out of petrol, with Johannesburg still many hours away. We only arrived by late afternoon, when most of the attendees, the writers, the activists, and the hangers-on already had their full of what we believed was a scrumptious lunch, followed by afternoon tea and cucumber sandwiches. Only the organizers and a conscientious few stayed on, courteously listening to our hastily rescheduled Tokalisa presentations. That evening, I stayed over at the Dangor's house in Brooklyn, the first of several subsequent enjoyable stayovers. We talked about the Joburg scene, writing, politics, and culture, mostly in English, even though I knew from his poetry collection, Bulldozer, that he spoke and wrote Afrikaans fluently. It was only afterwards, in our conversations, that I gathered that his mother tongue was in fact Afrikaans, and that through his mother, he had a direct linkage to Cape Town. All of it obvious from the descriptions and cadences of his first novella, Waiting for Lila. However, all his schooling was through English. Yet in his writing, particularly in his prose, the palimpses of his mother tongue remain ever present. One cannot live in any metropolitan city without realizing the multiplicity of voices and varied influences, the hybridity of human existence. Dangor's family history, like those of so many South Africans, is a study in metropolitan hybridity. In several interviews over the years, he often recounted their story with subtle humor, recalling their Indian, Dutch, Cape Muslim extractions, its multilingualism of Afrikaans and English, and Sotho, and a father who was a polyglot, speaking 13 languages. Most of his writing exhibit traces of various strands of hybridity, often recalling our tortuous South African histories, whether these are the squalid surroundings of Hillbrow in Z-Town trilogy, Muriel and Janie Marais, where Muriel and Janie Marais are coming to grips with their personal states of emergency, the mythical and fantastical in the act of storytelling, and the transformational in the key characters in Kafka's Curse, or the long memories of past horrors in Bitter Fruit and Dikeledi, his last published novel. In most of his longer prose, Dangor explores the lives of women, their positionality within South African patriarchy, their continuing relationships with power, and frequently their resilience in the face of social challenges. In his last writings, one gets the impression that Dangor increasingly experienced a sense of disillusionment with the post-1994 South Africa. Much of this awareness is filtered through the experiences of his prose characters. When we met, Achmat was still a manager at the Revlon Cosmetics Company in Johannesburg. Soon thereafter, he moved on to several NGOs, and in the late 1990s became the executive director of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, and later campaign manager at UNAIDS in New York. Achmat's standing with Nelson Mandela was such that the latter personally intervened to entice him back to South Africa to head up the Nelson Mandela Foundation. One can barely underestimate the pivotal role Achmat played in securing funding and resources for community organizations, including the Writers' Forum and later the Congress of African Writers, during his tenure at the various non-governmental funding bodies. His writing represents the teachable trajectory of an important South African writer, from his early musings and convictions as a Black consciousness adherent to the 1970s, his commitment to non-racialism in the 1980s and 1990s, to his incisive explorations of post-liberation disillusionment. Achmat's oeuvre is worthy of greater attention. One last personal memory. When we relaunched Tydskrif vir Letterkunde as a multilingual literary journal, I asked him to contribute a story to our launch edition in September 2001, He promised he would, adding, "I'll contribute to whatever you're involved in." Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in New York, he could get very little done. 2 years and a bit had passed, and he only managed to make his contributions, the short story, A Reason to Love, in the first issue of 2004. Most importantly, he kept his word. Farewell, my friend.
Thank you very much, Professor Oliphant. 1 second, please. Sir Willemse, thank you very much for those incredible remarks. They're so appreciated. As you can imagine, we are currently navigating the evening throes of load shedding across South Africa, and participants are popping in and out. We will now, however, go not to South Africa, but I believe to London. I'm not exactly sure where you are, Isobel, but we're going to go to Isobel Dixon, who is a poet and managing director and head of books at the Blake Friedman Literary Agency, London, where she represents writers from around the world. Isobel was born and educated in South Africa. Her debut poetry collection, Weather Eye, won the Sanlam and the Olive Schreiner Prizes. Her forthcoming collection, The Landing, will be published by Nine Arches UK, and she is working on a poetry music art collaboration about nature and travel, which began as a response to D.H. Lawrence's Birds, Beasts, and Flowers. Of course, D.H. Lawrence spent his last days in my part of the world currently, New Mexico. Hopefully we can meet here someday, Isobel. Isobel was Achmat's longtime literary agent and wrote a short publishing history of his novel Bitter Fruit for the latest issue of the JRB, which I encourage you to go check out. But for now, handing over to Isobel.
Thank you, Ben. And I hope this remains clear. I was thinking of calling this piece about Achmat something like Fierce Fragments. I was pulling together fragments of things that Achmat had written, and I hope that my words aren't coming across to you in a fragmentary fashion today, because I've been having a bit of Wi-Fi issues, and I can't blame load shedding. Maybe I can blame Brexit and supply chain issues here. So when Achmat died last year, and again when writing my introduction about Bitter Fruit and his international publication for the JRB, for which opportunity, Ben, great thanks, I trawled through many files and old emails, feeling so sad about the loss, but grateful for the contact I had and wishing there had been more time, both more time with Achmat and with his work, and more of that work to spend time with. But I'm so glad today that we are all spending time with Achmat and his memory and his work, which deserves so much more time and attention. And thank you so much to Audrey and to Zach and to all my comrades on the call, on the stream here today. So I went book trawling and archive fishing again this weekend, and was struck by how much Achmat could say with such economy in his messages, a function of his intense working life perhaps, coupled with his intuition and empathy, a creative fusion of practical and poetic concision. Back in 2007, a journal asked me for some poems, along with some from Achmat. I told him by email how much I had enjoyed reading the poems. Till then, in my agenting role, I had only read his prose. He answered in one of his typically short but thoughtful emails. Dear Isobel, I also enjoyed your poetry. It's a revelation sometimes to meet the literary persona, in inverted commas, of someone you know. Best regards, Achmat. So I've been thinking of literary personae in many forms, of the many facets of Achmat Dangor, and also of the many swirling, doubling and shifting identities of characters in Achmat's work and in his own life, the range and force and variety of it, the lovely hybrids of Kafka's Curse, which Ivan Vladislavić referred to earlier. Yet all of these spinning fiercely around a central energy and concern for justice and freedom, a liberation of the mind, body, and spirit, the freedom to make and share fierce art. Freedom and the loss of it was, of course, a central question for Achmat, who was banned by the apartheid government in the 1970s and thus not allowed to meet with more than one person at a time. In an interview, he told Jean Meyrang that he had counted by using that time fruitfully, writing furiously, honing his craft. He said, "Writing became something of an obsession for me, much more than a mere desire. I came to need to write." And that need and that craft was our gain, our provocation and inspiration. Many people along the way have remarked to me that they were surprised, for which also sometimes read shocked, to know the quiet man and then to discover the more furious forces in his written words. Not in the many papers, reports, and speeches he gave around the world to illustrious audiences in various forums, but the work that ranged freer in his mind and in poetry and prose on the page, especially after he was released from that ban and all that it represented, all the suppression and destruction that he had witnessed in his own community before and the crushing further in South Africa in the years after. He was a gentle man and a gentleman, but by no means meek or mild, and he was often fierce and furious on the pages of his own work, with a deep belief in the power of literature. I've looked over evolving biographical notes over the years, taken in glimpses of past travel schedules, visits to the UK and the US and Europe with packed meeting agendas with politicians, conferences and development organizations, even when he was in the UK for the shortlist of the Booker Prize, squeezing in all the other responsibilities that he had. It can be hard to square the man of that packed agenda and those conferences with the poetry and short stories, earthy, visceral, multilingual, as we've just heard as well, filled with scent, color, force, love, desire. And I am freshly filled with admiration, awe even, that he managed to encompass so much in such a short span of time. I just want to read the first paragraph of the piece I wrote for the JRB. There's more there that pays tribute to many other people who have been influential in Achmat's publishing life. But I wrote there, Achmat Dangor's writing came to me in the early days of my publishing life as a rich, mysterious gift. I was fortunate to be asked by Achmat's South African publisher, Andries van der Merwe, to sell international rights to Kafka's Curse, which she had published at Kwela Books. And as Ivan said earlier, I think a bold publisher for a bold writer. It was bought by a discerning young editor in America, Dawn Davis, at Pantheon, hailed as a New York Times notable book on publication in 1999, and translated into 6 languages. The Baltimore Sun wrote, "It is entirely wonderful, delicious, moving, mysterious, wise, and profoundly provocative. Read it." As I read that now, I think also that we should all read it. But I also think of how in so many ways Achmat himself was mysterious, wise, and profoundly provocative. An old soul with a great capacity for mischief, as well as a deep empathy. Like his writing, multifaceted and hard to pin down. There's more in the piece on the JRB about the publishing side and the Booker Prize, and lots more to say. But I just wanted to share some words that have come to me since sending out news of this commemoration. Toby Mundy, the publisher who bought Bitterfruit in the UK, is now an agent. And in his email to me, he added, "All my memories are of a wonderful man and a very, very fine novelist." And James Roxburgh, editor at Atlantic Now, said, "I joined perhaps a couple of years after Bitterfruit was published, But if I don't quite recall the Booker shortlist time, I do remember the terrific pride that Toby and the early Atlantic team had in publishing Achmat. He's very much part of our origin story. And I was thinking again about the presence of Achmat and his authorship, his authority, his way of being in so many spaces. I was looking through my shelves, and I owned I think this Raven edition, Waiting for Layla, long before I came to read the Queller Books edition of Bitter Fruit, which Andries published. I can never get this right. There we go. And also, when we heard from Andries Oliphant earlier, I was reaching for my copy of Starfrider, for which Achmat was also, I think, on the board, and Andries was editor, and of course many names that we know there. So very much part of the DNA in so many ways. On Facebook, Anderson Tepper in New York also wrote that Kafka's Curse and Bitter Fruit were two of his favorite books, and he hopes to see more of Achmat's work published in the US. And as Hein Willemse said, his oeuvre is definitely worthy of greater attention. His writing may have been fiery, both sensuous and fierce, but it was a slow burn in reaching readers at times, as the story I tell about the Booker shows how many editors turned that down before Toby Mundy finally bought it for the UK, and there were braver publishers in other markets first too. But all of us here are involved in that flame, in that spark, in that fire, and every conversation, every quote, every event is more kindling, is more spark, and I feel very privileged to be one of the many keepers of the flame. And I realized earlier the other word that came through, as well as fierceness and fieriness in the work, was the description of Achmat. I think it was Ivan who spoke about him as both galvanizing and reassuring, or was that Ben? I can't remember now. But those twin poles of Achmat, both that gentleness, that way of turning the focus around from himself, as he did in that email about poetry, to someone else, always concerned, always thoughtful, always listening. And some of that comes through in a quote in Bitter Fruit at the head of one of the sections. The 3 sections are memory, confession, and the last part is retribution. But the part 2, confession, has this epigraph: since in order to speak one must first listen, learn to speak by listening, which is from Rumi. And I thought very much of Achmat when I read that, which is why I'm now going to stop speaking, and I'm going to listen to other people and thank those who've already spoken for all they've had to say, which I will be thinking over for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isobel. Lovely words, and again, thank you for reading from those excerpts. Those of you on YouTube will see in the chat that load shedding has indeed struck part of our event. We're trying to get people to come back on via mobile, but while we wait for that, I will turn the microphone over to someone who is here, Andrea Nattrass. Andrea Nattrass is the publisher at Pan Macmillan, South Africa. Of course, Achmat's publisher, and the publisher of so many other incredible writers. She has worked in this position since February 2010. It's a long stretch of publisher, helping to bring the work of inspirational South African authors to local and international readers. She does it so incredibly well, and publishers often don't get the limelight or the credit. Believe me, Andrea, you deserve both. I will now hand over to you. Please unmute.
Thanks, Ben. Those are very kind words. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you from the bottom of my heart to the JRB and to all those involved in organizing this event in honor of Achmat. Indeed, Pan Macmillan is privileged to have been Achmat's publisher for his short story collection, Strange Pilgrimages, which we released in 2013, as well as a reissue of that book, a shortlisted novel, Bitter Fruit, which we've heard so much about, originally published in 2001 and reissued in 2017. And then his most recent novel, Dikeledi, which was also published in 2017. These three titles, in addition to his many other works of fiction and poetry, form a substantial body of work for which Achmat has been deservedly recognized here this evening, but also more widely as one of South Africa's, I can only call him a literary light and a treasure. The well-deserved praise and awards that have come from readers and reviewers alike have included in 2015 that Lifetime Achievement Award for his literary oeuvre from the South African Literary Awards. It was in working on Strange Pilgrimages with Achmat that I was particularly struck by Nadine Gordimer's description of him as a writer who, she said, reaches in search of discovery of life beyond and below the surface, which is the mark of the real writer, out of reach of the imagination alone. Gordimer's words resonated with me because they spoke to my impressions of Achmat as a person and as a writer. He himself humbly described both Bitter Fruit and Dikeledi as novels that explore through the eyes of ordinary people the unresolved legacies of our troubled past. And in my experience, he was someone who was interested in knowing people's stories and hearing more about their lives. I first met Achmat in 2012 at his office at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, where he was the CEO. He was warm and engaging and charmingly mischievous in some of his observations and comments. One of his questions to Terry Morris, the MD of Pan Macmillan, and to myself was, "What new books are you working on?" This was followed by, "Who do you think are the young writers to look out for?" We chatted about some of Pan Macmillan's forthcoming titles, and I could feel his genuine interest in and excitement about authors he had never heard of before. Only towards the end of our meeting did Achmat turn his attention to his own collection of short stories, which he was hoping Pan would consider publishing. These two questions, what new books are you working on, and who do you think are the young writers to look out for, came up regularly in my interactions with Achmat over the years. He often made the efforts to attend Pan Macmillan's book launches, and he would apologize profusely whenever he missed an event. He would also engage me in discussions about the Pan authors he had read recently and was always interested to know what I thought of a particular author's voice and why Pan had published that person. There's one particular encounter that I want to share with you in a bit of detail because for me it typifies Achmat's generosity of spirit and his interest in these new writers and new voices. In 2015, Pan Macmillan published a memoir called To Quote Myself. It was written by Langa, an advertising executive working for Coca-Cola at the time, and someone widely recognized as a popular commentator on social issues. I guess Kaya was an early example of someone who today we would call a social media influencer. Kaya's goal with To Quote Myself was to encourage those who have never read a book to pick up his memoir and learn about his complicated journey from the village in the Transkei where he was born to his successes in the advertising world in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and in his story to see aspects of their own reality reflected. It's certainly not a literary memoir, but it rapidly became a bestseller, and it clearly struck a chord with readers, many of whom commented that it was indeed the first time they had bought a book. It was also, at one point, it had the dubious distinction of being a retail chain's most stolen book, but that is a story for another time. Then we heard that To Quote Myself had been shortlisted for the 2016 Sunday Times Nonfiction Award, which is arguably South Africa's most prestigious nonfiction literary prize. Achmat was the chairperson of the nonfiction judging panel of that Alan Paton Award at the time. When the shortlist was announced, Achmat spoke about his hopes that the shortlisted books would prompt readers who should include political and business leaders, and crucially the born-free generation, to think anew about so many things we take for granted today. No one was more surprised than Kaya to be shortlisted for the award. He was distinctly nervous when he joined the Pan Macmillan team at the Gala Award ceremony. Remember when we still had those? In June in Johannesburg in 2016. Kaya kept telling me how he was struggling with imposter syndrome in a room filled with real writers, especially those whose titles were also shortlisted for the non-fiction award. Achmat suddenly appeared at our table and introduced himself to Kaya. He congratulated Kaya for being on the shortlist, and then he said to him, "I have to tell you, I was skeptical about the literary value of your book before I started to read it." Kaya was understandably a little bit taken aback. He started to splutter a reply, but Achmat continued, "How wrong I was. You opened my eyes to your story and your journey in a way that was compelling and a revelation. You completely deserve to be on the shortlist, and I haven't stopped recommending your book to people." With these words and a characteristic gentle pat on the arm, he left us to continue with the evening's proceedings. Kaya didn't win the award that night, but he couldn't stop talking about how generous Achmat had been to come to our table and to let him know that he definitely belonged in that room of real writers. When I saw Achmat subsequently, he spoke again about the value of Kaya's writing and the different perspectives it had brought to the judging team as they evaluated the various submissions. He had a comment for me too. "Andrea, initially I asked myself why you published a book like this, and then I answered my own question in the reading of it. Congratulations to Pan Macmillan on publishing such a fresh new voice. May there be many more," he said. These days, Achmat's words are never far from my mind when I'm evaluating a manuscript, and I'm truly grateful to have had the opportunity to work with him as a real writer. Yes, he undoubtedly was that, but also as someone who gave so generously of his time and his skills to develop that broader literary landscape that he cared so deeply about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And indeed to everyone who has participated. We are holding out hope that our final speaker, Mandla Langa, can join us. But I believe the load shedding situation in his part of the world is a little too severe, and we are not going to be able to hear his words tonight. And I should have mentioned that Andrea's remarks were entitled Achmat Dangor More Than a Real Writer when I introduced you. Apologies for that, Andrea, and apologies for any other mistakes I might have made with names and dates today. I beg your leniency, as always. ESCOM has helped to scramble things a little bit, including my brain and WhatsApp channels. So I would like to then move to the conclusion of the event. Mandla Langa was meant to be our final speaker. He's a member of the JRB's editorial advisory panel, and of course has recently published a novel called The Lost Language of the Soul, which was received with incredibly wide critical acclaim. If you are able to get a hold of The Lost Language of the Soul, I highly recommend that. It is an amazing book, a joy to read, possibly Mandla's finest, although that's saying something. And I hope it goes on to win many, many awards. Mandla, we missed you tonight. Thank you very much for giving it your best shot. His remarks were to be entitled Achmat Dangor, The Quiet Strength. And I think that's an incredibly appropriate way to remember Achmat. I would like to thank all of today's speakers who have illuminated his literary life so poignantly. He was a man of quiet strength, and he was an inexhaustible fount. I'd also like to extend thanks to the JRB's editor, Jennifer Malik, who put this live stream together along with all 47 of our issues and counting. do visit johannesburgreviewofbooks.com to see everyone's amazing work on that platform. And thank you finally to the audience members who listened to our commemoration today and those who tune in the future. I would like to conclude our event with the words of Ariel Dorfman, the Chilean writer, perhaps best known for his play Death and the Maiden. He wasn't available to speak today, but he did send a personal message of support. Ariel wrote, "Achmat was like a brother in so many ways, and his loss is a tragedy for family, friends, and his country, not to mention the world beyond, given his talent and combination of activism with feats of the bitter imagination. Achmat, our world beyond, the one in which your mind lives on through your books, the one that for me includes an almost fabulistic evening of literary conversation and slow strolls on the island of Tenerife, which I've written about elsewhere, remains grateful for your extraordinary contribution. We won't forget. Cheers and a luta continua." Thank you, everybody. All the very best.